Good evening. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education for the National First Ladies Library, located at the First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio, where we collaborate with the National Park Service to bring you programs and exhibitions inspired by the First Ladies of the United States. Before we get started with this evening's programs, I just want to tell you about some upcoming programs and exhibitions and activities, both virtual and in person, that we are offering. And I also want to encourage you to share any questions you have for this evening's speaker in the Q&A. If you're having an issue hearing, I know sometimes people don't realize that there's no sound to our little scrolling PowerPoint at the beginning. But if you're having issues tuning in for AV, you can always also post those in the chat. Usually I can help you figure things out. And a lot of times the very kind people in the chat will help you figure things out as well. So we want to welcome you again. It looks like we have people tuning in from all over the country and all over the world, and that's amazing. I want to invite you to come to Canton, Ohio sometime in the next year, because on May 1st, we have a brand new exhibition opening up. It's called Beyond Camelot, The Life and Legacy of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and it takes a look at Jackie Kennedy throughout her entire life, from her time in the White House to her time prior to being First Lady as a camera girl, and her life after the White House as an editor. So we're super excited to be hosting the exhibition. We were gifted a collection of First Lady related memorabilia and artifacts by Monty Durham, who you may be familiar from Say Yes to the Dress, Atlanta, especially if you're tuning in tonight for our speaker, who is connected to Georgia as well. So one part of his collection is a replica of Jacqueline Kennedy's Anne Lowe design wedding dress. So we're so excited to be hosting that exhibition. We have a big opening coming up, and we'll have many programs throughout the summer, as well as some big legacy lectures coming up in the fall. So hopefully you can tune in for that. This evening's talk is being recorded, so if you've registered and you can't tune in for the whole thing, we will be sending that out afterwards. Some other programs I want to mention to you. On April 24th, we have Cooking with the First Ladies. It's a really super fun program hosted by Sarah Morgan of the Instagram account Cooking with the First Ladies. She does sort of a romp through First Lady history and popular culture, and then shows you some beloved recipes of the First Lady that is focused in on. So we're going to be looking on Monday at Mamie Eisenhower. So if you're a fan of Mamie's $1 Million Fudge, you might want to check in with us, or if you have a Mamie Eisenhower pink bathroom, well, I'm sure we'll be discussing those. Legacy lecture. If you are here to learn about Frankie Welch, then you will probably want to return on May 3rd for our virtual legacy lecture. We will be hosting Kimberly Chrisman Campbell, author of Red, White, and Blue on the Runway, the story of the first and only fashion show to ever take place at the White House. So that should be really fun. May 16th, we have our film discussion. We're going to be watching South Side with You. You can tune in online for that. And May 30th, we have our book club discussion. We're going to be reading a fictional book called Jackie and Me. So I'm very excited about that. So that's all of my housekeeping, and without further ado, because I have some very active cats for once here tonight, screaming and coming into the screen. So without further ado, I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Ashley Callahan is an independent scholar and curator from Athens, Georgia, specializing in modern and contemporary American decorative arts and craft. In 2022, the University of Georgia Press published her book, Frankie Welch's Americana, Fashion, Scarves, and Politics. And the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library at UGA presented her exhibition of the same title. We're very excited to be also hosting in the next month this exhibition as well. A taste of this exhibition. So we hope you can come and see both of our exhibitions opening in the next few weeks. Her other books include Crafting History, Textiles, Metals, and Ceramics at the University of Georgia, and Southern Tufts, the regional origins and national craze for chenille fashion. She is a contributor to Ornament Magazine and has written for the magazine Antiques, Metalsmith, and the Journal of Modern Craft. She served as Curator of Decorative Arts for the Georgia Museum of Art from 2000 to 2008. Callahan received her bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Sewanee, and her master's with honors in the history of American decorative arts from Smithsonian Institute and Parsons School of Design. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ashley. Yeah, and someone's saying it's obviously my sweater that is attracting the cats tonight. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn things over to Ashley, and I'll be in the chat.
Okay, does this look right, Allison? I have the screen sharing.
It looks great.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for joining me. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to share Frankie Welch's story with you. And this evening, I'll give an overview of her life and career, highlighting her connections to the First Ladies. And these connections helped launch her career as a scarf designer and significantly increased her media presence. People pay attention to First Ladies fashion, so having First Ladies wear and want and promote her designs was a big deal. So as Allison said, my talk is based on my research for a book published last year by the UGA Press with Georgia Humanities, and for an exhibition last year at the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Georgia in Athens. And there's a virtual version of the exhibition on the Hargrett's website. The images I'll be sharing come from the collection of the Hargrett, from the Rome Area History Center in Rome, Georgia, and from Frankie's family, and I will include a few informal research snapshots. So Mary Frances Frankie Barnett was born in Rome, Georgia in 1924, and that's up in northwestern Georgia. She was the youngest by far of 4 children, and in the photo on the left, she is with her sister, who was the next youngest. And she demonstrated a skill for fashion and design at a young age. She graduated from high school in 1941 and then went to Furman University in South Carolina, where she majored in clothing and design. She exhibited an entrepreneurial streak early on as well, and she set up a small business as a student in her dorm room, where she helped, as she described them, the rich girls get dresses made for the various balls and parties. And I believe she was helping them select flattering patterns and fabrics, but she was not actually sewing the dresses herself. Her father, who worked for the telephone company, had saved enough money for her tuition, but not for books and other expenses, so she needed to earn some money herself. And after her junior year of college, she married her childhood sweetheart, Bill Welch, who was serving in World War II at the time. And you see him on the photo on the right. And they lived briefly in Pensacola, Florida, where he was stationed, then for a short time in Rome, Georgia, where she taught home economics at the local high school. They then returned to Furman in 1947, and Frankie graduated in 1948 and Bill in 1950. They then moved to Madison, Wisconsin for Bill to pursue his master's degree in American history. And Frankie both took and taught sewing classes while she was there. She also greatly admired the architect Frank Lloyd Wright while she was there, to the point that she knew when he went to the bank, so she would take her car and park at a nearby corner and sit and watch him and sketch what he was wearing, because she thought he dressed so perfectly for his size and image. In 1952, the family, which now included the first of 2 daughters, Peggy, moved to Alexandria, Virginia, for Bill Welch to work with the federal government. And Frankie pretty soon started teaching various classes and seminars on fashion and sewing and home economics, often focusing on how to coordinate a wardrobe. She also did private consulting, and she was very confidential about her work, not revealing the names of her clients. And these activities, the classes and seminars and private consultations, helped her to develop an impressive network of prominent women in the DC area. And one of the women she met early on was Betty Ford, who had moved from Grand Rapids, Michigan to DC in 1949 when her husband Gerald was elected to serve in the House of Representatives. And they moved to Alexandria in 1951, so the year before Frankie. And Betty and Frankie were both young mothers. Frankie's other daughter, Jeannie, was born a few years after the family moved to Alexandria. And both Betty and Frankie lived in the same neighborhood for a while, went to the same church, and they both had a strong interest in fashion. So of the first ladies, Frankie's ties to Betty Ford were the earliest and the strongest. And when Frankie began her career in Washington, D.C., in that area, most of the women she was working with were, like Betty Ford, wives of politicians and diplomats and government leaders, rather than elected or appointed officials themselves. Nonetheless, they were often in the media spotlight, so their fashion choices were important. And Frankie helped them with all aspects of their appearance, even advising women on the best way to hold a purse when being photographed. And Frankie soon realized that traveling to multiple destinations to put together a wardrobe was incompatible with her young family's schedule. So in 1963, she opened her own shop where all of the elements of a wardrobe could be provided in one place. She and her husband purchased a historic building known as Duval House in Old Town Alexandria, which was not quite yet the popular tourist destination that it is now. And for the first years, the family lived upstairs and Frankie had the shop downstairs. And the shop, which was called Frankie Welch of Virginia, was immediately successful. And it became not only a place to shop, but also an important social hub. Frankie maintained a busy schedule of activities there with trunk shows and book signings and other events, so it really was a place to be. And for some context, Frankie opened her shop in September of 1963, while Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady, a position she held, of course, until November 22nd, 1963. So there was a lot of fashion attention being paid to Washington, D.C. and the White House at the time that Frankie opened her shop. And Frankie was a fan of Jackie Kennedy and once described her as the greatest thing fashion ever had in the White House. And the shop excelled in giving personalized attention. And even for a while, at least, they kept cards on each customer with their sizes and what they'd purchased, that Frankie and her staff could recommend items that would go with what the women already owned. Or they could help the people get together clothing choices, even if the woman couldn't come in. So for example, if someone had to travel overseas, suddenly Frankie could help them get a wardrobe ready. Betty Ford was an early customer at Frankie's shop, and she continued to purchase clothes there throughout her husband's political rise. And these images are from slides that Frankie's family had, and they're just informal shots of Frankie and Betty Ford together in the alterations area of the shop. And Frankie sold clothes primarily by American designers in a middle price range. And the designers included Oscar de la Renta, Jeffrey Bean, Adele Simpson, Vera Maxwell, and Molly Parnas. She also sold some of her own designs, especially this dress, which she called the Frankie. And it's a fairly simple design, loosely based on a kimono. And she created it initially as a tool for teaching students about various historic waistlines, because you can tie it high and have an empire waist, or you can tie a natural waist, or you can do a crisscross effect, you can tie it in the front or the back. And the fact that it could be tied all these different ways was one of its appealing qualities when she began to market it. It could also be made in different fabrics and with different patterns and with different trims sometimes. One reporter noted that this was the dress that had been to more White House dinners than any other, and that women wearing Frankies didn't mind running into other women wearing Frankies at the same events because each one looked different. So when you think about the different patterns and the different fabrics that drape differently and the different ways you can tie the dress and the different figures that they would be on, each one looked different. Another one of the women who frequented the shop was Virginia Rusk, whose husband, Dean Rusk, was Secretary of State from 1961 to 1969. And he, of course, like Frankie, was from Georgia. And on one visit, Virginia told Frankie that the State Department and the White House needed a new something that they could give as gifts. And Virginia said that it should be something truly American. So Frankie, who was aware of the current vogue for signature scarves, and those are scarves with the designer's name featured prominently, decided to make her own signature scarf featuring the Cherokee alphabet. And this was in 1967. And she had seen the alphabet, which actually is a syllabary rather than an alphabet, with the characters representing syllables rather than phonemes. So she had seen it described as an alphabet in an old book of her father's on the history of Rome, Georgia, during a visit to her hometown. And she considered the Cherokee alphabet to be truly American and to represent her home state and Dean Rusk's home state. And according to family oral history, she also believed that she was part Cherokee. So this, for her, honored her ancestors as well. Current genealogical research does not support this familial Cherokee connection, but that is what she was told and what she believed for her whole life and what the media enjoyed reporting. And the scarf was well received the scarf was well received, and the State Department and the White House did use it as gifts. So that means that First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, gave this scarf as gifts, which is a pretty impressive debut for a scarf designer. And even with this first scarf, Frankie recognized the possibilities and the importance of making the scarf's introduction into an event. And that would get media attention, and it would make the women who received the scarves feel that they, both the women and the scarves, were even more special. So to introduce the Cherokee alphabet scarf, she had a fashion show in Alexandria, Virginia. Hote Casella, who's a Cherokee mezzo-soprano, played drums and chanted as models demonstrated various ways to wear the scarves. And you see her on the right of this photo. And among the models were two wives of presidential aides, Libby Cater and Shirley Pearson, the wife of the Venezuelan ambassador, Josefina Tejera Paris, the wife of a Democratic congressman from Florida, Rebecca Rogers, and Betty Ford, who you see in the left of this photo wearing a Cherokee alphabet scarf. And her husband was House Minority Leader at the time. And the list of women involved in this event really attests to the success and prominence of the network that Frankie had developed by this time. Fashion designer Norma Norell made a skirt from yardage of the scarf material, and that was featured in the fashion show, and that's what you see on the right. And this was an important endorsement from the American fashion world. And this scarf remained Frankie's bestseller throughout her career, and she had it reprinted more than 40 times in a variety of colorways and on different fabrics and with some variations to the design. And she also used the design on neckties and tote bags, and she used yardage to make outfits. And at least two first ladies wore this pattern. On the left, Betty Ford is wearing a Cherokee alphabet shirtwaist dress as she packed to move to the White House. And on the right, Rosalind Carter is wearing a Cherokee alphabet scarf. Frankie's second scarf in early 1968 was also a high-profile affair. Lady Bird Johnson was the first lady then, and in the photo on the right, she is wearing a white wool dress that she bought at Frankie's shop. A couple of the women who worked for her were frequent visitors to Frankie's shop, and they were Bess Abel and Liz Carpenter, the social secretary and press secretary. And through them, Frankie ended up designing a scarf for the first and only fashion show to take place at the White House. The show had the theme of Discover America in Style and featured American designers, and the backdrop for the runway showed a projection of famous sites across the country, and the band played patriotic music. It was attended by the wives of the governors. There was only one female governor at the time, and she was unable to attend, so it was all wives, as well as some of the designers and other VIPs. And as Allison mentioned, in a couple of weeks, the National First Ladies Library will host another Zoom event with Kimberly Chrisman Campbell, who wrote a fabulous little book on this fashion show that came out shortly after the Frankie book, and I encourage you to attend that as well. So for her scarf, Frankie used the words "Discover America" over an abstract shape of the continental US in red, white, and blue, and it kind of suggests a travel poster. And the scarves featured prominently on the runway, and you can see some of the ways they were worn by looking at the models around Mrs. Johnson in the photograph. And then all of the attendees received a scarf as a gift. And they actually received temporary scarves, then were sent professionally manufactured scarves in the mail later. Because this fashion show came together very quickly, and Frankie didn't have time to have the scarves professionally printed, so she and the White House drafted a bunch of volunteers to go to her shop and hand paint and hand screen print and hand hem these initial scarves. In her book on the fashion show, Kimberly Chrisman Campbell reports that Mrs. Johnson gave the Discover America scarves as gifts to the female journalists who accompanied her on her April 1968 Discover America with the First Lady tour of Texas. And then a couple of months after the fashion show, Frankie was honored by Lady Bird Johnson at one of her Women Doers luncheons at the White House. And this newspaper clipping is from that event. And Mrs. Johnson continued to shop at Frankie Welch of Virginia even after her time as First Lady. And a press release from the shop in 1976 noted a lot of recent events and included, on Tuesday of a recent week, Mrs. Lyndon Johnson, visiting the Washington area, stopped in to add a few items to her wardrobe. And the two women became and remained friends. And in 1984, when the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library and Museum presented an exhibition of Frankie's designs, Mrs. Johnson hosted a luncheon in her honor. After the fashion show for Lady Bird Johnson, who was a Democrat, Betty Ford asked Frankie for equal time for the Republicans, and they decided that she would design a documentary fabric around the theme of fresh as a daisy, rather than using the traditional elephant motif. And she created this daisy print held up by Betty Ford and Pat Nixon, and this was before either of them was First Lady. And this image is from the Nixon Presidential Library. And from a distance, it looks like a conventional floral print, but it subtly incorporates the text, Republican National Convention, Miami, Florida, and August 5th, 1968. And it was used to make dresses for hostesses to wear at the Republican National Convention in Miami that year. And though not a First Lady yet, Nancy Reagan reportedly wore a dress of the fabric to the convention, and Ronald Reagan was presented with a Western shirt made of it. The material actually debuted earlier in the year at a fashion show for a Republican luncheon on May 1st at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, where it appeared as tablecloths and as several dress designs, with Betty Ford again serving as a model. And Frankie described this event as a show of reality, explaining beforehand that she would not make fashion predictions, but she would show what the women will actually wear for campaigning and to conventions, adding, "I'll give tips on how to dress for press and TV appearances." The following month, so this is June 1968, Betty Ford, while wearing a daisy print dress, presented Happy Rockefeller with a scarf of the RNC material at a luncheon in Rockefeller's honor given by the Republican Congressional Wives Club. Frankie then designed hostess dresses and a scarf for supporters of Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, who also ran for president in 1968, and he was a Democrat. For these dresses, which she called H-line dresses, which is a play on the popular A-line silhouette, she wanted them to be both highly visible in photographs and on television, which they were, and she wanted them to be fashionable beyond the novelty of this one election season. And that they were appreciated as stylish, as pretty dresses, is especially well conveyed by one story in particular. And this is from Betty Ford's autobiography, The Times of My Life. Quote, "Once, Frankie came into her shop, caught me parading around in a dress I thought was really pretty, and hooted, 'Take that off. You don't want that, Betty. It was designed for Hubert Humphrey's campaign workers.' Sure enough, the decorative stripes down the sides and the band across the waist formed a very nice capital H, end quote. So she decided not to buy it after all to wear to the Republican National Convention. The Humphrey scarf, you'll notice, has a reserve in the lower right corner for his signature. And for most designers making signature scarves, the only signature that mattered was their own. But for Frankie, she often used signatures in different ways, including reserves like this, either pre-printed with a famous person's name or blank so that the scarf's owner could have it signed, or she incorporated signatures into the overall design. This scarf is unusual in that her name is only sewn on the tag and the tag sewn on the back. After that, she always had her name or initials somewhere on the scarf. She was really excellent at branding. Richard Nixon was the winner of the 1968 election, and Frankie designed scarves for him that were given out at his inaugural ball. Pat Nixon received the first scarf a little over a week prior to the inauguration during her debut press conference at the Pierre Hotel in New York City. And the media noted Frankie's ability to be bipartisan during the 1968 election season, and she believed that was an important key to a successful business. And she liked to be able to say that Democrats and Republicans shopped side by side in her shop. After the amazing success Frankie experienced during the 1968 election, she decided to expand her scarf business. So she put together a brochure about her scarf designs and sent it to 5,000 American businesses, telling them that she could make them a scarf that was fashionable and personalized and meaningful. Much of her scarf production focused on limited edition custom scarves that businesses or individuals or churches or schools or museums or various associations could commission. Some of these were used as souvenirs of events, swag at conferences, gifts to patrons, or they were used as fundraisers or incentives. She could work out a way for anyone to need and want a scarf, and she loved selling them. And she designed likely thousands of scarves from the late 60s through the 1990s, but there is no master list, so I'm not exactly sure how many she did. First and foremost with her designs, Frankie wanted to be fashionable. She said it wouldn't sell if it wasn't fashionable. So you can trace the history of scarf fashion during these decades through her scarves. Her earliest ones were primarily large squares and silk or cotton. And then as we get into the early 70s, she moved to a smaller size and introduced her distinctive 8 by 8 inch module designs, which was an inspiration from Frank Lloyd Wright, who often used modules in his architecture. She usually made scarves of 1 by 4 modules, as in this example from the National Federation of Republican Women for the 1984 convention in Dallas, and she printed yardage to make Frankie's and other garments. She also hemmed single modules, so an 8 by 8 piece of fabric, and called them napachifs, which is a combination of cocktail napkin and handkerchief. And often in the 1970s and the first half of the 80s, her scarves were made of the popular synthetic materials of the era. So you see a lot that are in polyester or triacetate, and one she particularly favored was Kiana, which is a silky nylon from DuPont. Today, we're not so enamored of these synthetic fabrics, but they were fashionable at the time. In 1970, Frankie introduced her 50 State Flowers scarf, and it debuted on May Day at the Washington National Cathedral in DC during the annual Flower Mart for the Garden Clubs of America. And it received national media attention. And for this one, she took inspiration from the White House china that Lady Bird Johnson had ordered from Tiffany's. And in this service, the dessert plates have the state flowers painted around the border. So Frankie and her scarf put most of the flowers in clusters and groups around the edge, but she selected one to go alone in the center, and that's Georgia's state flower, the Cherokee rose. And again, she used yardage of the scarf to make garments, including this lovely dress on the left. She also made a shirtwaist dress for Betty Ford that Betty Ford wore when she first stepped out of her Alexandria home to greet reporters after Nixon announced his impending resignation, as you see on the right. So this is what Betty Ford wore when she learned that she would soon be First Lady. And it's a brilliant choice. It was by an American designer, and it had a White House connection through the China, and it represented all of the states. And partly because of the success of her Cherokee alphabet design, Frankie introduced other Native American inspired designs, including this one with turtles in 1971. And the turtle motif is based on an image she saw on an early piece of pottery in Arizona. And I do want to acknowledge that Frankie's Native American inspired designs now can be understood as cultural appropriation, and that's a hot button topic in fashion. But I believe that Frankie handled it about as well as she could have at the time. She genuinely believed that she was part Cherokee. She worked with LaDonna Harris, who was and is a Native American rights activist and a member of the Comanche Nation, to get a clean copy of the syllabary to use when making the original Cherokee alphabet scarf. And she donated a percentage of each sale of that scarf to a fund supporting education for members of the Cherokee Nation. And I also want to say that Mrs. Harris enjoyed wearing Frankie's Cherokee alphabet designs because they were good conversation starters. People were curious about them, and they helped her talk to people about Native American issues and rights. And I'm really honored that she wrote the preface for the Frankie book. And then decades later, Wilma Mankiller, the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, also liked wearing a long Cherokee alphabet scarf. Frankie's designs were also part of a larger vogue for Native American inspired designs. So for example, if you think of hippie clothing with leather and fringe and feathers and beads, that's another expression of the same style or impulse. So again, Frankie was being fashionable. And as with many of her designs, she produced turtles as a scarf, and she printed yardage to make garments, especially Frankie's. And she also made a shirtwaist dress of the fabric for Betty Ford. In 1973, Frankie introduced a group of 4 more Native American inspired designs that she promoted with Goldwater's department store in Arizona. And one of those was based on Cherokee basket patterns. And you see her here in her shop with some of the baskets that she collected. And she used one of those designs on the cover of a book she wrote that year titled Indian Jewelry, in which she talks about how to collect and display Native American jewelry. And Betty Ford attended the launch party for the book Indian Jewelry at Frankie's shop at a time when national media interest in her spiked. So this was following her husband's nomination to be vice president and preceding the approval of that nomination. And the 2 women were photographed together by the AP, and Betty Ford is wearing a necklace designed by Frankie and manufactured by a costume jewelry company in New York, and it's loosely inspired by Native American designs. And these Native American inspired designs also fit into the theme of Americana for Frankie and her peers. And though always somewhat nebulous in meaning, in the 1960s and 70s, the term Americana generally suggested early American antiques, folk art, colonial revival designs, or simply anything in a red, white, and blue color scheme. In fashion, it could mean inspiration from the military, the trappers of the frontier era, Native Americans, or iconic pastimes like baseball. And the term typically indicated patriotism and nostalgia. And while the term Americana encompasses nearly all of Frankie's scarves, including ones related to politics and branding, it was most closely linked to her Native American inspired designs and to her creations for the US bicentennial, which I'll come back to. Later on, Frankie used one of the Cherokee basket weave patterns on a small tote bag for Barbara Bush, and you can see that it has Mrs. Bush's signature on it. And I don't have any more information on this tote except that it survives in a group of Frankie's archives. Here, Betty Ford, as First Lady, is wearing a Member of Congress scarf by Frankie, as her husband nominated Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president in December 1974. It's a perfect patriotic choice, and it looks great with that white dress. And as we saw with the Humphrey scarf, Frankie left a reserve in the corner so that it could be signed. And this particular scarf is in the collection at UGA, and Frankie had it signed by numerous Georgia politicians in DC, so the signatures extend beyond that reserve in the corner. And it would be interesting to know who signed the scarf that Betty Ford was wearing. Frankie told one reporter, "Mrs. Ford has 60 of my scarves, and she knows how to tie them and wear them." So here, Betty Ford is wearing a Veterans Administration scarf by Frankie as her husband speaks before the 75th Annual Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in Chicago in 1974. So women could wear Frankie's scarves to show their political affiliations or their support of various institutions or involvement with different academic or social groups. Often putting on a Frankie scarf was and still is about more than just finding a pretty pattern and colors that look nice. It's a statement of your interests and affiliations. And here, of course, Betty Ford is showing through fashion her support of veterans. And Frankie's husband directed the Veterans Administration Congressional Liaison Service for many years, so Frankie had a strong connection to the VA. And when Frankie's husband died in April 1975 after a year of illness, Betty Ford, while First Lady, attended his funeral in Alexandria. In the following year, she included Frankie in a White House dinner for the Prime Minister of Australia and his wife, which was a kind gesture and special invitation that Frankie's daughter Peggy says made her mother feel good during a difficult time. And it's a nice mark of their friendship. Frankie's daughter Peggy also remembers that, especially early in her time at the White House, Betty Ford often called Frankie to bring her clothes or to come visit. And in a 1984 interview, Frankie shared, "We talked nearly every day when she was in the White House." And in a later interview, she explained, "Well, you know, we were so close. It was like sister to sister." Frankie also designed a custom scarf with Betty Ford in early 1975. It featured polka dots, which Betty Ford liked, petunias, which were her favorite flower at the time, her signature, and colors that matched her favorite turtleneck shirts. And they had a press conference at the White House to introduce it. The two women posed with the scarf for media photographs that appeared in newspapers across the country. And in a talk in 1991 at the Smithsonian, Frankie shared a story about the photo session. So one trick that Frankie often shared with her customers or suggested to her customers was that they stand slightly behind someone or something else in photographs to appear slimmer. And of this photo, she explained, "We really had to jockey for positions. Mrs. Ford said, 'Frankie, I'm standing behind you.' And I said, 'I know you are First Lady, and I know you deserve to, but I invented this.' So we both had to hide behind the scarf." And the Fords first presented the design as gifts at a governor's dinner in February 1975. And the president even acknowledged the scarves in his toast, stating, quote, "We do appreciate the honor of your visit, and as a small souvenir, it's my understanding Betty would like the ladies to have this first edition of a very special scarf she has designed with Frankie Welch over in Alexandria. I believe you found them on your chairs as you came in. Betty and I hope that even in the chilliest of days ahead, they will prove or provide you, I should say, with the warm memories of this particular evening," end quote. And Diana McClellan, who is a famous Washington gossip columnist, once remarked about this event that Frankie was the only chickie who ever got Jerry Ford to do a commercial for her. On the left, you see where Betty Ford wrote her signature several times on Frankie's letterhead to get the one that they used on the scarf. And Frankie produced this scarf originally in large squares and long rectangles of Kiana, so that's silky nylon. And in addition to giving them as White House gifts, Betty Ford allowed Frankie to sell them in her shop, with 5% of the wholesale sales going to the White House Historical Association. And these are some images showing preliminary sketches for the scarf. And the timing of the introduction of this scarf was notable. The New York Daily News reported, quote, "Betty Ford expected her mail to be against her strong stand for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution. She acknowledged yesterday that the mail was 3-1 against. On the other hand, everyone seems to approve the 32-inch pink, orange, and green scarf she showed yesterday, end quote. So this scarf helped provide some needed positive press to balance the negative press that she got for supporting the ERA. Frankie designed numerous scarves for the 200th anniversary of the United States in 1976, including a module version of the Betty Ford design in red, white, and blue, which you see on the left, and a module version of the Discover America scarf, which is next to it. And this scarf, the Discover America scarf, was one of several bicentennial scarves that she designed that were related to American presidents. So in this version, she added Lyndon Johnson's name to it. The scarf on the right celebrates the original 13 states, and the design was based on a souvenir button from George Washington's inauguration that I believe she had seen at the Smithsonian. And if you're looking for a Frankie scarf of your own, which I totally encourage you to do, this is the one that you're most likely to find. It was produced, I believe, in the greatest numbers and was the most popular. Frankie really became known for her Americana designs, and these are some great examples. Duval House, where she had her shop, had several connections to George Washington. He had banked there when it was a bank, and he'd also visited there when it was a tavern. So just the act of shopping at Frankie Welch of Virginia had some Americana cachet, and her connections to the First Ladies only emphasized her credibility as a purveyor of Americana fashion. Frankie and Betty Ford made fashion headlines again in June 1976 when Betty Ford donated a dress designed by Frankie to represent her in the Smithsonian Institution's First Ladies collection. Most First Ladies donated their inaugural gowns, but Betty Ford's husband, of course, did not have formal inaugural celebrations. So instead, she selected her favorite dress, one she considered timeless and not gimmicky, and with a swingy skirt so that she could dance in it. And Frankie used a light green fabric embroidered with chrysanthemums and sequins of the same color, and zigoline, which is a nylon crepe chiffon, making it the first dress with a synthetic material to enter the First Ladies collection. And demonstrating her attachment to the gown, Ford requested that Frankie make her a duplicate of it before she donated the original. And Ford wore this dress to numerous official functions, including state dinners for the Shah and Shah Banu of Iran in May 1975, and King Juan Carlos and Queen Sofia of Spain in June 1976. And the donation to the Smithsonian was a landmark event in Frankie's life. And she invited not only her daughters and son-in-law to the celebration, but people special to her from her childhood in Rome, including her second grade sewing teacher, her high school home economics teacher, and the first boy who ever took her on a date. And guests to the event received a module version of the Betty Ford scarf as gifts. In a close vote, Gerald Ford lost the presidential election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter, ending the Ford's time in the Washington area. And though Betty Ford and Frankie did not see each other frequently in the following years, they remained friends. And in an interview in 1984, Frankie described Ford as a very close friend and stated, "I consider her a friend forever." But Frankie was a Georgia girl, so of course she had connections to the Carter White House as well. And her link to the Carters actually predated their time in Washington. And she designed this scarf for them in 1973 while Jimmy Carter was governor of Georgia. And as the story goes, Rosalind had initially asked for a quilt-themed scarf, but so had the First Lady of Virginia, Catherine Godwin. And she asked first, so she got the quilt scarf, and the Carters ended up with this amazing peanut design because of Jimmy Carter's family business. And they used the scarves as gifts at the governor's mansion in Atlanta. And the first scarves were printed on silk, and then because it was so popular, they had a second run printed on cotton. Frankie also printed some yardage to use to make a Frankie. And I love this dress. It's by an American designer. It's by a woman. It's by a designer from Georgia. It's got a connection to the Carters, and it's covered in peanuts. It's really Americana fashion at its best, or at least at its most. And this dress on the left is in the collection at UGA. And on the right, you see Rosalind wearing a peanut Frankie with Frankie in the governor's mansion in Atlanta. And because the first peanut scarf was so successful, when she was asked to make a scarf for Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign in 1976, Frankie returned to peanuts. And that's Frankie's son-in-law, Paige Williams, modeling the peanut tie and pocket square. Rosalind Carter appeared in public numerous times wearing scarves by Frankie, both during her husband's presidential campaign and as First Lady. So for example, in a photograph that ran on the front page of the Washington Post, she's wearing the first peanut scarf while watching the primary returns. And in the photo on the left, which ran in Newsweek in May 1976, she's wearing the 13 original states scarf during an Easter sunrise service in Plains, Georgia. And in August of 1980, she wore a Cherokee basket weave scarf while she and her husband observed the 60th anniversary of women's right to vote. She also wore Frankie's Mental Health Association scarf, which you see in the bottom right, that was designed in 1977, and Mrs. Carter wore that numerous times. For her first public event following her husband's inauguration, Rosalind Carter attended a meeting of the Women's National Democratic Club, where she was named Woman of the Year and presented with a commemorative scarf by Frankie. And this one's unusual because it's slightly wider than the typical 8x8-inch module. It's a lace design with the initials RSC for Rosalind Smith Carter in the middle. And around the border, it reads in a pretty script, Women's National Democratic Club, 1977, and Woman of the Year, Rosalind Carter, and designed by Frankie Welch. And I did find a picture of Mrs. Carter wearing this scarf when the Carters visited Brazil in 1978. And this scarf also demonstrates how customized Frankie could make her scarves. So it clearly honors Mrs. Carter and it documents that specific event. And women who supported Mrs. Carter could show that support by wearing this scarf. And they could also show people around them that they were able to attend this special event with the First Lady. And Frankie had a few branches of her shop outside of Alexandria in the late 70s and early 80s, including Frankie Welch of the Capitol from 1978 to 1984. And that was on Liberty Plaza across from the old Executive Office Building, which is now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. So it was right near the White House. And of that location, she explained, I'm bringing my business to my clients. And it worked. And one notable event that brought Rosalind Carter to the shop's DC location was a book signing in 1980 for Edna Langford and Linda Maddox's biography, Rosalind, Friend and First Lady. And on the right, you see Mrs. Carter with Frankie and her daughters outside of the shop. Following the Carter administration, Frankie continued to create designs related to presidents and their wives, among her many other designs. And she also did numerous scarves and other items for presidential inaugurations. In particular, she designed scarves, neckties, and umbrellas in red or blue on white with these repeated RBs for the 1981 inauguration of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And that's what you see in these images here. She also designed a variety of scarves, totes, and ties for Reagan's second inauguration in 1985, for George H.W. Bush's inauguration in 1989, and Bill Clinton's inaugurations in 1993 and 1997. But those weren't specifically for First Ladies, so we'll move on. As far as I know, First Lady Nancy Reagan did not shop at Frankie Welch of Virginia, but Frankie certainly noticed her fashion. And in 1981, just after Ronald Reagan became president, the Washington Dossier quoted Frankie on popular colors and fashion as saying, for sportswear, lots and lots of red jackets, red sweaters, and I'm calling it Nancy Red. And here on the left, you see a nice red, white, and blue scarf that Frankie designed in 1986 for the second annual Nancy Reagan Tennis Benefit to raise funds to end drug abuse. And on the right, you see a tote bag, a small tote bag that she may have designed for Mrs. Reagan. This is kind of a mock-up design, so I don't know how many she actually produced, but it's an interesting survival in Frankie's archives. Oops. In the mid-1980s, Frankie returned mostly to large silk square scarves and some cotton bandanas. And again, these shifts in scarf style reflect her awareness of fashion trends. And the scarf on the left was for the US Naval Academy's 30th reunion of the class of 1960, and the bandana on the right was for Bill Clinton's first inauguration. Frankie's last scarf connected to a first lady was a large silk square with a painterly image of vegetables. This was commissioned by the Senate wives for a First Ladies Luncheon honoring Hillary Clinton in 1993. In the following year, when Mrs. Clinton made remarks at the Senate Spouses Luncheon, so I like that it switched from Senate wives to Senate spouses, she began with, "You know, I have this scarf on that I got last year, which I have loved and worn." I can't confirm yet that she's talking about this scarf, but it certainly is a possibility. Frankie's shop in Alexandria closed in 1990. Often when businesses close, they kind of fade away quietly. But when Frankie Welch of Virginia closed, it made headlines. And Lady Bird Johnson, when she heard the news, called Frankie to reminisce about the shop. And though Frankie closed her dress shop in 1990, she continued designing scarves until around 1999. By then, she was beginning to experience the early signs of dementia, so she retired to Charlottesville, Virginia, near one of her daughters in 2001. And Frankie Welch died in September 2021. And Frankie occupies an interesting place in American history. Some people remember her vividly, and for them, everyone knew who Frankie Welch was. However, for a lot of people, especially younger people, she's a new name. But as a female entrepreneur and a Southern designer, she really was remarkable. She created and followed her own career path to great financial success and media acclaim and fashion renown. And her scarves provide this rich material history of our country, at least for her circle, during the last several decades of the 20th century. And they are great examples of Americana fashion. And I've just shared a few today, but each of the hundreds, if not thousands, of her scarves is a window into American history and culture. Each one tells a story. And they certainly are closely connected with the first ladies of her era. And following that connection is a fun way to talk about her scarves and her career. But it's only one of many approaches. So I encourage you to check out the Frankie book and learn more about her designs and just take some time to appreciate this interesting and successful American designer. So I'll be happy to answer questions now. Let's see.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was amazing. It was so fun to see so much color and pattern. I'm wondering if, first of all, you could talk about, when it comes to scarves, did Frankie give instructions on how to wear the scarves? Thinking about that there are so many ways to fold a scarf or to wear a scarf, but given that kind of 1x4 kind of format, what was the most popular way to wear a Frankie Welch scarf?
You can wear it so many ways. So the piece of paper that showed all the different ways to tie the Frankie dress, she also had flyers like that for the scarves, both for the square scarves and for the oblong scarves. So, you could tie it around your neck and let it hang straight. You could do a little sailor knot. She had a way to tie a flower. You could tie it in your hair. You could tie it on your purse. You could tie it on your wrist. You could fold it up and wear it as a pocket square. You could take two and make them as a belt. She had ways to tie scarves to make bikinis or to make tops that you could wear under your blazers. Yes, she had a lot of ideas about wearing scarves. And there is, if you go to the Brown Media Archives at the University of Georgia, they have some videos of Frankie, and a couple of them, she talks about different ways to tie scarves. And I'm really happy that we were able to preserve those videos through the research for this book. And then you can hear her voice. She's got a great Georgia accent.
There's a lot of discussion in the chat about what you are wearing.
I'm wearing Betty Ford's.
Okay. And then there's a question about, people are asking where to find them, where's the best place to shop for them, and then authenticating them. Will she always have the signature on the scarves?
98% of the time, she'll have her name on it, or she'll at least have her initials on it. And that 8x8 module is really distinctive to her scarf designs. As far as I know, no one is knocking them off. So, I mean, they generally what you see is what it is. It is a Frankie Welch scarf. I have been buying them online for a long time, mostly eBay, Etsy, Poshmark, Ruby Lane. And then since I'm in Georgia, in Athens, where she spent a lot of time, she liked to come teach here in the Family Consumer Science program. I find a lot at estate sales, and people are finding them at thrift stores. Because they have kind of reached a point in the market where their original owners are, downsizing their homes, or things are passing to next generations. So it's a good time to try and make sure that they're appreciated and don't just get lost. So yeah, go out and buy some scarves.
I'm definitely,
I have most of what I want, so I won't try and outbid you.
I was definitely perusing them before we were meeting
It's
today.
been fun. So when we had the opening reception for the exhibition, everybody wore scarves, and I was texting with her daughters and family members to make sure we're all wearing something different. And then I distributed scarves to all my friends around, so everybody had them. Even my 12-year-old son, he wore one bandana style around his head. It looked fabulous.
I've been thinking about contemporary women in politics and how wearing pins is such a political trend. So wearing the flag pin, and we've hosted Anne Hand for a talk before, but I haven't seen as many scarves. Are there still women politicians who are wearing scarves to message ideas and say things?
I haven't really been looking to see if they've been wearing scarves lately. I know during the Obama campaign, they had a lot of custom designer scarves, which was incredible. I was looking at a lot of pictures of Hillary Clinton lately to see if I could find her wearing Frankie's scarf. So she's still wearing scarves, but I don't know that they're as communicative as Frankie's scarves are. But like when women in Congress wear white for women's rights and women's voting, and that's using fashion to communicate. So it's the same kind of thing. Frankie's was just obvious about it.
Yeah. I'm so curious about this idea when you first introduced the boutique and the shop of Betty Ford being this political wife and mother and needing to find clothing, and that they needed this one-stop shop boutique. Do you find that was a trend for political wives of that era?
But if you think about DC, you have people coming from all over the country, not necessarily coming from style centers. So they're coming, and they're, all these, very complicated levels of etiquette that they need to follow. And Frankie was a good guide for that. And I think people really appreciate it. So, not a lot of people write or talk about this, but I was able to talk to LaDonna Harris, and she's basically, Frankie took her under her wing and taught her to love fashion and taught her how to dress. And if she knew that Mrs. Harris would be in the public eye, she would help her get something fabulous together to wear for it. So yeah, you had people coming from not style centers who needed some guidance when they got to DC.
And did she have relationships with designers like Adele Simpson and Oscar de la Renta?
That's a good question. She didn't talk so much about it. I think she was well connected, but I don't know that she was particularly close with any of them.
Okay. I'm also really curious about this idea of Rosalind Carter and her connection to Frankie Welch, because when we usually talk about Rosalind Carter and her inaugural dress, it's that she was buying something off the rack, that she was recycling something that she wore before. So to see her actively engage with a designer is really exciting. Was that unusual for her?
That was probably more of Frankie's doing than Rosalind's doing, but it was a thing for these political wives to get scarves from Frankie. Lots of people were doing it, so it, would not have been out of step for Mrs. Carter to do that. And I believe that Frankie and Rosalind Carter met each other when they're up in Northwest Georgia, both speaking at a historic Native American site, and then they rode back to Atlanta together. So Frankie had plenty of time to convince her that she needed a scarf. So I think that's probably how that came together. And then I know that there was one reporter in Alexandria who I think wrote, well after the fact, but wrote about how, when each new group came in, when the Carter administration came in, just like every other previous administration, they shopped at Frankie Welch of Virginia. And there's a funny story of LaBelle Lance, whose husband was Burt Lance and worked in finance with Carter, that she was there for a Christmas party and brought her husband because she needed for him to know where she was going to be spending a lot of her time.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, Mrs. Carter was not so well known for fashion, but she was connected to Frankie and had those moments.
What are your current research endeavors? Are you still working on Frankie? Have you moved on to another designer?
Well, I'm still enjoying Frankie, but I also, the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library has an amazing archival collection from a designer named Freddie Widdop, and he was designing for ice skating shows and for Broadway. He did the famous Hello Dolly outfits, and he was a dancer himself. So I'm going through his archives and working on an exhibition for the Hargrett, and hopefully more if I can work it out.
Well, Ashley, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It was so great and wonderful to see these colorful scarves and get a taste for Frankie Welch's designs. And we're so excited to be hosting selections from this exhibition.
I'm so excited that y'all will have them too. I love for Frankie to be getting all this attention.
Yeah, thank you so much. And can you tell us the name of the catalog again so people can look it up?
Frankie.
I haven't.
This should be easy.
Frankie Welch's Americana, Fashion, Scarves, and Politics. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay.
That's right.
So I highly recommend it. It's full of these amazing photographs and lots of colorful fashion. And again, please connect with us at firstladies.org to find out more about the upcoming exhibitions, from Jackie Kennedy's Beyond Camelot to the Frankie Welch scarves and clothing that will go up later, late in May. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ashley, for joining us this evening. That has been really wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.